This has been a very cursory view of the goal. What is met here at the beginning will be repeated and explicated over and over again as we walk the dark path of God's wrath visited in the book of Revelation. It is worth mentioning, though, that this goal is not grasped by the passive, nor is it gently handed over to the aspirant. Rather, Jesus, when speaking to these churches, continues to use the word conqueror. This implies that the road to the end is in many ways a battle, and more than one battle. Conquerors are not victors of one battle, but of many, many battles across many lands. They are also not defenders, but usually aggressors, which we can rephrase as being assertive. All of this begins to inform John of the attitudes needed to reach the goal. This is a process, one that is engaged actively, but with patience and perseverance. As we explore this vision further, we will see that this fits what we will be finding throughout much of the book of Revelation. What is revealed is a process of spiritual growth following a pattern that others would summarize as the process of the mystical life. This process was summarized in the beginning of the second millennia by St. Thomas Aquinas. He labeled these 3 degrees of spiritual development as beginners, proficients, and perfect. Another manner of describing this has been more descriptive in calling these degrees the purgative way, the illuminative way, and the unitive way. The purgative way is dominated by a period of time and effort dealing with bringing the sensual life and the passions under control. It is the work of realizing that the passions and the senses are here to serve a higher purpose, rather than the psyche being enslaved to the desires and demands of the physical life. The purgative way itself is comprised of 3 degrees. The initial stage is the subjugation of the egoist's demands by means of the virtues. The next degree is bringing the dominance of the physical senses under control. And the final degree is bringing the inner demands and passions in submission to the deeper self, or the human spirit. These final 2 degrees have become known through the works of St. John of the Cross as the dark night of the soul. According to St. John of the Cross, the next stage along the path is the dark night of the spirit, or the illuminative way. For St. John of the Cross, the dark night of the spirit is the next degree of purification, by means of which the soul progresses beyond meditation and ordinary contemplation toward the spiritual marriage. Its purpose is the detachment of the soul from seeking delight now in spiritual experiences and from the final vestiges of ego dominance, even the love of one's own virtue, with the goal then of complete union with God. The illuminative way is walked by those who have now brought their sensual and passionate lives into order so that they are not susceptible to falling into a completely worldly life, no longer tempted by the dangers which lead to hell, but who still do take such pleasure in earthly things, they allow their minds to be distracted by varied imaginations and their hearts cluttered with numberless desires. Even though those in the illuminative way are to be considered virtuous, living a life more focused on God than on life in the world, still they are not prepared for a complete abandonment to God. The unitive way is, as its name implies, the degree of the spiritual life at which the person is becoming more and more focused on his or her identity in God, and God becomes the dominant focus in all things, so that in the end, God becomes everything to everyone, or all in all, as is quoted in 1 Corinthians, the 15th chapter. If we are in need of another varied view of this same process, it is given to us by St. Bernard of Clairvaux. He described there 4 stages of the spiritual life. The first is a person who loves himself for his own sake. That is one would probably call the fully worldly man, destined for hell and one in need of true purgation. He is the one that is still totally dominated by his sensual and passionate desires. In classical terms, this is the person dominated by pride, or whom we would say today is narcissistic, focused on personal gain and personal ego. In the second degree or stage is the person who now attends to God, but does so still for his own personal sake. This is the person who acknowledges that God exists and so serves God in order that he will get blessings and not go to hell. This person of the second degree is still one more interested in his own skin than in truly knowing God, and it is only still only at the beginning of the purgation process. Virtues and right behavior are practiced and employed, but primarily for self-serving purposes. Next is the person who loves God for God's sake. The attempt of living a life of virtue has now prompted an influx of grace that, if apprehended, leads the individual to enter the dark night of the soul. This in turn leads to more grace and the beginnings of the dark night of the spirit. Now they have entered the illuminative way. There is still an affection for the things of the world and even for the good life, but love of God, for God's sake, has begun to take hold. Now this person, if they submit to the greater influx of grace afforded, enters St. Bernard's 4th degree, the love of self for God's sake. And this is the unitive way, the final of the 3 mystical paths. The unitive way is walked by those whose minds and hearts are so drawn away from temporal things that they find deep peace in God alone. These 3 ways were presented in one of the greatest poems of European literature, composed a few hundred years prior to St. John of the Cross and almost 1,200 years after John's vision. This was Dante's great A Divine Comedy, of which we spoke earlier. There Dante illustrated these 3 paths with his descriptions within the 3 divisions of his Inferno, Purgatatio, and Paradiso. With these mystical paths now in mind, we can conceive of the structure of the book of Revelation as an unfolding of that spiritual life. We may see that the letters to the churches comprise that preliminary excursion into the purgative way. These letters describe the virtues and attitudes necessary for progression across the degrees. In St. Bernard's conception, it is as if these letters are speaking to those in the 2nd stage or degree of the spiritual life, persons who want to avoid hell and gain the blessings of God, but who still have not fully detached from the senses or the internal passions. Temptations still dominate, and techniques, that is, prescribed behaviors, need to be willfully introduced to deal with these temptations. Following on the letters, the vision enters the purgative way proper, with the 7 seals and the 7 trumpets, describing the process of the dark night of the soul. After an interlude of 7 unnumbered visions, the book of Revelation progresses to the dark night of the Spirit, the illuminative way, explicated through the vision of the 7 bowls. These then give way to a description of the unitive way, put forth under another set of 7 unnumbered visions. With this in mind, and with this pattern before us, we can now return to the letters to the 7 churches, looking to them to instruct us about the attitudes and behaviors that we are to embrace prior to entrance into the deeper aspects of our spiritual development. After 2 millennia of development, much of what we hear in this message to the churches will sound quite familiar. Familiar as the cardinal virtues of ancient Greek philosophy and the theological virtues articulated by St. Paul. Certain of these are given special emphasis with specific messages. Love is highlighted in the letter to the Ephesus. Faith is seen in most of the messages, but with clarity in the letter to Smyrna. Hope in that to Philadelphia. Smyrna showcases courage or fortitude, while perseverance and patience are underscored to Thyatira. The letter to Thyatira also illustrates justice, while prudence or wisdom can be deduced from the message to Pergamum. Added to these are zealousness and mindful awareness in the letters to Laodicea. After interpreting these messages, we are now able to condense the directive to 8 principles. The first, associated with love, is to be motivated by love of the good rather than hate of what is evil. The second, associated with humility, is to remember that Jesus is in control of heaven and earth, to look to Him for guidance, staying faithful to His directions. The church is reminded, rely on Jesus alone. Do not be self-reliant. To rely on its own abilities or its own works places it in danger of taking God for granted and not seeing the need for a devoted life to Jesus. In that case, it becomes lukewarm. The church and the individual must be single-mindedly devoted to Jesus. The third is to stay faithful in the face of persecution by people who believe they are following God. This may even be the subtle persecution of loved ones thinking they know the best for you, and that the spiritual life is not that best. Take St. Francis and his troubles with his father as an example. In more overt ways, this persecution may include death, imprisonment, and economic hardship, to be dealt with by faith, perseverance, and fortitude. Likewise, with prudence, which can overcome avarice and greed that may lead to compromise. Then the church is told that it will be facing persecution from the justice system and the governments of the world. In dream language, it indicates that the path to be taken will be actively inhibited by the outer culture. As St. Paul relates, the spirit and the flesh will be actively in conflict. Therefore, the church is instructed to maintain the justice and ethics of the gospel alone, not allowing itself to be polluted by compromising with unjust governmental or pagan practices, even if this means death. The fourth principle is then to live by Jesus' guidance on what justice and ethics are when the world's governments persecute you for not following its concepts of justice and ethics, or when the culture persecutes you for being a person pursuing the inner life. The fifth principle associated with justice is to not be seduced by power or wealth, compromising what Jesus has taught. Once again, prudence and temperance will overcome avarice and greed. The danger here is that Christians will be seduced to seek to rule over others, this present world and in the world to come. All of these pursuits and desires are to be seen as coming from Satan. They are presented as occult, magic, and demonic. Now, associated with this seeking of worldly power and wealth will be the seeking of spiritual power. This seduction will come in the form of being taught that spiritual power and advancement will be accomplished by certain secret teachings. There will be a seduction to know the deeper things or secrets of God, not already taught in Scripture or by the apostles, even to understand the ways of Satan. The sixth principle, articulated in the letters, is that the Scriptures of the Old Testament and the teachings of the apostles is sufficient for salvation, for coming to the fullness of life promised by God. There is no secret, occult knowledge given to special Christians. The seventh principle is that the church must not dilute or compromise the way of Jesus Christ with the ways of the world or paganism. The warning comes because the church will be tempted to take on the role of other religions than what they formerly held in society. There they had been merely an adjunct assisting the worldly life. The church is called to live differently, keeping itself pure from new religions even. The compromised religions of mixing the world, paganism, and Christ. And finally, the eighth principle is one that has caused both trouble and consternation over the past 2,000 years. The trouble is that, applied inappropriately, this principle easily leads itself to anti-Semitism. What is emphasized here is that the church is the renewed Israel, the true temple of God. St. Paul made sure in his letters to accentuate the fact that even though the Jews had rejected Jesus as the Christ, this did not mean that they were rejected by God. He highlighted the reality that Jews were not in themselves evil because of their rejection. However, because this new church was persecuted by the Jews, especially by the leaders of the local synagogues, the church would have a tendency to separate itself away from Judaism and perceive itself as a totally new religion. The fledgling church was warned against this reactive tendency and instructed to hold fast to its identity as the true Israel, even in the face of persistent persecution and its seemingly insignificant stature. The church, and so each Christian, is the presence of Jesus, the presence of God, the presence of the temple, and the presence of heaven, as long as it manifests faith. The delivery of the wisdom of these letters and the application of virtues and attitudes outlined in them is further confirmed by our modern psychological understanding. In the 19th century, psychologists began to discriminate the various aspects of the soul into discrete parts. Up until that time, much of what was written would merely speak in a threefold manner. Philosophers would speak of the visible part of the person as the body or the flesh, the invisible part as the soul, and the true self or imago Dei as the spirit. Eastern Orthodox Christianity had other names for mind, soul, and intellect, terms such as nous, psyche, and soma, and the like. However, with the advent of the 19th century and what would later be described as the discovery of the unconscious, terms such as ego, complex, and archetype were born. It was also observed that many of the elements of the unconscious were much more powerful than the ego being that part of ourselves of which we are aware and with which we identify. When the contents of the unconscious are approached naively, the ego can be overwhelmed, and is, in a psychological manner, possessed. We see such possessions in the form of addictions and even in certain psychoses. It can be observed in certain inflations, which occur when the ego begins to believe that it is the possessor of this grander spirit. St. Paul warned the Corinthians of just this manner upon the preaching that they had now had access to the Holy Spirit. The Corinthians then assumed that the access was for the ego's purposes, rather than the ego was to be approaching the Spirit with an attitude of humility. The ego at the service of the Spirit, not the Spirit at the service of the ego. So St. Paul admonished them to not be puffed up or inflated with false pride when he said, "This is how one should regard us, as servants of Christ and stewards of the mysteries of God. I have applied all these things to myself and Apollos for your benefit, that you may learn by us not to go beyond what is written, that none of you may be puffed up," inflated. An even more recent term that we can give to this is a spiritual crisis. To be inflated, to let the ego think it is actually the Spirit, creates a spiritual crisis. And this has been applied to conditions seen in those persons who have taken on certain Eastern religious practices and New Age philosophies without taking the proper precautions of preparing the ego with the appropriate virtues as outlined in these letters. Subsequently, they developed certain psychopathologies, one of which surfaced in Japan and is referred to as Zen madness. Again, the psychologist C.G. Jung observed this in the beginning of the 20th century and noted that it is of the greatest importance that the ego should be anchored in the world of consciousness, and that consciousness should be reinforced by a very precise adaptation. For this, certain virtues like attention, conscientiousness, patience, etc., are of great value on the moral side, just as accurate observation of the symptomatology of the unconscious and objective self-criticism are valuable on the intellectual side. His observation is of the necessity for the ego to be fortified by virtues, awareness, and a conscientious attitude prior to engaging any exploration or deep dealings with the unconscious. What we find in the book of Revelation is an early explication of this wisdom. The letters appear to present the attitude that the individual ego must acquire prior to its encounter with the otherwise overwhelming nature of these visions to follow. When attempting to understand a dream, it is a good rule of thumb that the dream be initially taken subjectively and not immediately applied to the outer situation. One of the most common errors in the understanding of our dreams is that we jump to see it as answering the outer world situation rather than as the corrective to our own attitudes and expanding our limited understanding of ourselves. If applying the subjective approach does not appear to exhaust, then, the understanding of the dream images and messages, then we can be justified in looking at the message's application to the outer situation. As a dream, John would now have to decide, are these messages applicable only to him and his individual life, or are they truly for others as well? In the case of these letters, especially due to the fact that John had been the primary apostle in the vicinity of Ephesus and Asia Minor, for he was known to be the consecrator of Polycarp, the bishop of Smyrna, the application of the interpretation to the whole church, as well as to his individual situation, is more than justified. As we come now to the conclusion of these letters, The seeker is now ready to move along the purgative path, working to incorporate the principles presented into life. With this message received, John's vision shifts. He is now ready for the full plan of redemption, the healing of self and world to be revealed. A plan that will be inaugurated with the opening of the seals on the scroll of salvation in the hand of God.